President, I ask unanimous consent that Joshua Wolf, a fellow with the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of today's session, and that Allie Boyce and Kate Collars, interns with the committee, also be granted floor privileges for today's session.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come before the Senate today to call again for the ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now again, a little history. As you know, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act here in 1990. It was signed into law by President George Herbert Walker Bush on July the 26th of 1990, 24 years ago, last Saturday. Of course, that changed the face of America. Anywhere you walk, you see ramps and curb cuts and automatic door openers and accessible bathrooms and education, kids being integrated fully into schools under IDEA and the ADA. So it really did change accessibility and also opportunity in the workplace, for example, for people with disabilities. Some years after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, the United Nations set up a committee to study whether or not there should be a treaty, an international convention on the rights of people with disabilities. That committee drafted it after consultation with us here in the Senate and looking at the ADA. In fact, I was told by one of the persons very instrumental in this that the ADA really formed the basis. The Americans with Disabilities Act, I refer to it as ADA, that the Americans with Disabilities Act informed them on what they needed to put into the convention. That convention was sent out to member states for ratification in 2008. Since that time, 148 nations have ratified it, with one exception. Well, there's been more than one exception, but one glaring exception, and that's the United States. Now, it was sent down here after it was sent to the President under our constitutional system. This treaty was sent to the President. The President sent it out to all of his departments to find out what laws we had that needed to be changed. So it goes to the Department of Commerce, the Department of State, Department of Agriculture perhaps, and everything else to see what laws do we have to change to comply with this treaty. Well, it came back after about a year of this, and because the Americans with Disabilities Act was so good, we don't have to change any of our laws. None, because we're the best in the world on it. And it was sent to OMB to see if there would be any budget implications. And OMB said no budget implications either. After that, then, the President sent it to the Senate for ratification under our Constitution. It was sent to the Committee on Foreign Relations. John Kerry was then the chairman of that, Senator Kerry from Massachusetts. They had hearings. In fact, the two first witnesses at the hearings were Senator John McCain and myself and me. And then there was a lot of other people that testified, both Republicans and Democrats, business leaders, disability rights advocates, and others. This was in 2011. And then in 2012, it was brought to the floor in December of 2012. And that was a lame duck session. It turned out that 38 senators, all on the Republican side, had signed a letter saying that we should not vote on a treaty in a lame duck session. There were some other issues raised, but that was a big one. And so we brought it up for a vote. And as you know, in the Constitution, a treaty requires 2/3 vote of those present and voting. And so we fell 5 votes short. Well, that Congress ended. And so the treaty has to be resubmitted again from the administration to the Senate. It went through another hearing process. I know I had spoken with the ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee as to what we could do to advance it. And he wanted more hearings, so we did. So Senator Menendez from New Jersey is now the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. And so he had hearings, more hearings on it. And thanks to the leadership of Senator Menendez, the bill was reported out of the committee last week. it was put on the executive calendar yesterday. There has to be 3 days before they can send it. They sent it to the floor on Monday, 24-hour layover. It is now on the executive calendar, ready to be brought up. Now, I understand that we have a busy week this week, and a lot of things happening. I suppose people look around and say, well, not much happening here today. Well, but we're in, post-cloture. And under the rules, there's 30 hours of post-cloture unless time is yielded back. And evidently, I don't know if that's going to happen or not. I'm hopeful that sometime today, or late today maybe, or tomorrow, that we will have a unanimous consent request in terms of bringing up this treaty, this Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today, but I just wanted to give a brief history of where we are and why we're at this point. And during the past weeks, we've seen extraordinary efforts to move forward with this treaty. As I said, Senator Menendez, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, has marked up the treaty, brought it out with a 12-6 bipartisan vote. The committee added new reservations, understandings, and declarations that thoughtfully address the concerns that have been raised, including the matter of a parent's right to decide how their children are schooled, as well as issues related to federalism and sovereignty. This week, we're hearing from disability advocates from across the country. Yesterday afternoon, there was a big rally on the Mall calling for passage of the treaty. Many of our offices have been flooded by calls and visits from people with disabilities, veterans groups, business leaders, asking us to vote and pass this treaty. Businesses such as Walmart, AT&T, Sprint, Coca-Cola have urged passage of this treaty. In the days ahead, we'll hear from many, many more calling for its passage. Now, let me talk about a few of the issues that have been raised, and let me first talk about the issue of sovereignty. Some of our colleagues continue to express concern about some aspects, particularly with regard to sovereignty and reproductive health. Let me talk about sovereignty first. But I want to say this first of all. It's important to address these issues thoughtfully and respectfully. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in a bipartisan fashion, did so last week when it approved a series of new reservations, understandings, and declarations. Now, for those who don't know what that means, every treaty we adopt has what's called RUDs, R-U-D-S, reservations, understandings, and declarations. What are those? Those inform other treaty nations on how we will adopt this treaty, how under our laws and Constitution we will comport with that treaty. Just about every treaty we have has some reservation or understanding, a declaration. So that's what they are. So the Foreign Relations Committee adopted new reservations, declarations, and understandings, but concerns remain. My good friend, the senior senator from Utah, last week spoke eloquently about his genuine concerns about the possible loss of U.S. sovereignty. In answering my question as to why this convention is different from the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor Treaty, he expressed his fear that the Disabilities Convention would, and I quote, threaten American sovereignty and self-government, end quote. Now, let me just tell you about the senator from Utah stated that the Child Labor Convention, which we passed here in 1999, that's what we're talking about. It's the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor. We adopted it here in 1999. So, the senator from Utah said that that convention gives authority to ratifying countries to determine whether they are in compliance with the convention, while under the Disabilities Convention that we're talking about now, the CRPD, as it's known, he says that under that, the UN determines whether ratifying countries are in compliance with their treaty obligations. Here on the floor, my good friend from Utah stated that, quote, the Disability Treaty gives the last word on whether this nation is in compliance to the UN. The child labor treaty leaves that entirely up to each nation, end quote. Well, the fact is, Mr. President, that the review process of compliance is essentially identical in both the worst forms of child labor treaty that we adopted in 1999 and the CRPD that we're discussing right now. Now, let me further explain that. When an ILO member, that's the International Labor Organization under which that treaty was signed, when an ILO member state ratifies this convention, it's required to submit regular reports. Those reports are reviewed by the ILO's Independent Committee of Experts. Keep that phrase in mind, Committee of Experts. It's reviewed by them on the application of conventions and recommendations, and they're known as the Committee on Experts. The Committee of Experts, I should say. The task of the Committee of Experts is to assess the extent to which the ratifying member's legislation and practice are in conformity with the ratified treaty. This is an external review committee, and the United States has always supported this type of review. The process guarantees fairness and openness in implementation of treaty obligations. Now, while it's been suggested that the United States should conduct its own compliance with treaty obligations, I ask my colleagues, would we be comfortable with all countries assessing their own compliance with important international standards? I don't think so. For example, just take any treaty. Take the START Treaty, the Arms Control and Reduction Treaty. Would we be content to say, okay, Russia, you tell us how you're in compliance with that, and just accept their word for it? We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't do that with any country with which we have a treaty. So that's why there's always an external review process. An external review to see whether country A, B, C, or D who have signed on to a treaty, any treaty, is in fact in compliance with it. So, you wouldn't make treaties and say, okay, country X, you tell us whether or not you're in compliance or not, and we'll just accept that. No one would do that. It goes back to Ronald Reagan's phrase, trust but verify. Yeah, we'll trust, but we want verification. So, in the situation with the worst forms of child labor, the one that we adopted here in 1999, the conclusions and recommendations of this Committee of Experts on an external review, and it's the same in the CRPD, the same word. The Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities sets up a, quote, Committee of Experts, just like under the worst forms of child labor, a Committee of Experts, to review whether or not a country is in compliance, basically. Are they really implementing the treaty as they said, as they said in the treaty? Now, again, so we have these two Committee of Experts, one in the CRPD, one in the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor. That treaty, again, as we adopted here unanimously in 1999. The senator from Utah supported that. Now, the recommendations and conclusions of that Committee of Experts under the worst forms of child labor that was set up in 1999 are not legally binding on the United States or any other country. Although these recommendations often have great moral weight and persuasive value, the findings cannot be imposed on any government. It is up to each ratifying member to determine whether and to what extent it will act upon those recommendations. That's the same in the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. This Committee of Experts will certainly go in and do external reviews of whether a country is in compliance or working to be in compliance They may issue findings and conclusions and recommendations, but they're not binding on any country. They're not binding on the United States. Let me repeat. It is up to each ratifying member to determine whether and to what extent it will act upon those recommendations. A review of practices is common whenever a nation undertakes an international obligation, whether it's by treaty or any other international agreement. Now, this does not equate to forfeiture by the American people of our right to govern or of our sovereignty. It does not amount to any abandonment of our cultural and social values in America. So, Mr. President, in terms of this external review of compliance, there is no substantive difference between the Child Labor Convention we passed in 1999 and the UN Disabilities Convention that we hope to bring up. Both treaties have much the same reporting requirements, oversight mechanisms, recommendation process, and, quote, committee of experts. And just as in 1999, with that earlier treaty, the United States is in no danger of losing any of its sovereignty with the Disability Treaty. None whatsoever. We weren't before, and we aren't now. These are recommendations. And why should we be afraid of an external review by a committee of experts to see whether or not we are in compliance with this treaty on the rights of people with disabilities? It was modeled after the Americans with Disabilities Act, for crying out loud. I mean, we're already in compliance. We're far ahead, quite frankly, of any other country. Why should we be afraid of any review of our laws and practices in terms of people with disabilities? There shouldn't be. We ought to be proud of it. In fact, we ought to be proud of exporting the Americans with Disabilities Act. So given these facts, I ask my colleagues, why is it acceptable? Why is it acceptable to have sufficient reservations to protect our sovereignty for a treaty about the worst forms of child labor, and a treaty on torture, and a treaty on degrading punishment, and not be able to have sufficient reservations that protect our sovereignty when it comes to a treaty regarding people with disabilities? What's the difference? From my review of this issue and the review of legal experts, there is no substantive difference to the threat to our sovereignty. And as I have stated previously here, scores of Republican policymakers agree with this, agree with me. If you're concerned about sovereignty, I hear some of my fellow Republicans are concerned about losing our sovereignty under this treaty. I would point out that former President George Herbert Walker Bush, who signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, is in strong support of this treaty. Are you telling me he doesn't care about our sovereignty? I don't think so. Former President Bush, strong supporter of this. I kind of think he cares about our sovereignty. Every former Republican leader of this Senate since the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, I'm talking about Senator Dole, Senator Lott, and Senator Frist, are all supporters of this treaty. I kind of think they care about our sovereignty a lot, too. I know every one of them. Dick Thornburgh, former Attorney General under George Herbert Walker Bush, Attorney General of the United States, is in strong support of this treaty. Don't tell me he doesn't know what's in the treaty. He knows every legal part of it. And he cares deeply about our sovereignty. And he says this is no threat to our sovereignty whatsoever. The American Legion, big supporter of this. You telling me the American Legion commander and all those veterans aren't concerned about our sovereignty? You bet they are. But they know this bill, they've read the treaty, and they say it doesn't affect our sovereignty. Every veterans group supports this bill, and they do care about our sovereignty. So, I hope that we can lay that issue aside This does not impinge and does not threaten our sovereignty any more than other treaties. And we have a reservation in there. Every treaty that we sign has a reservation in there that says basically this treaty shall be applied in the United States in accordance with the Constitution as interpreted by the United States. So basically, every treaty we sign says basically we're sovereign. Our Constitution is sovereign. There was a court case called the Bond case, which was recently decided, I think, in May, Supreme Court. A lot of people were wondering whether or not that would affect this treaty, because it was a case brought by the United States against a woman for violating the Chemical Weapons Ban Treaty because she'd been trying to poison one of her husband's lovers or something like that. The Supreme Court said this is nonsense. Get out of here. Those laws are covered by the state of Pennsylvania, not by a treaty. And so that kind of put to rest any idea that somehow this treaty overrode our Constitution, our federalism, and the fact that these criminal laws are state laws. That just happened in May. The other issue that has come up is reproductive health. Some of our colleagues have also voiced concern regarding the provision on sexual and reproductive health of women with disabilities, as it was mentioned in Article 25 of the treaty. Now, for those not familiar with this provision, the treaty says simply that, quote, persons with disabilities have the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health without discrimination on the basis of disability. The article goes further and says that those countries ratifying the treaty shall, and I quote, provide persons with disabilities with the same range, quality, and standard of free or affordable health care and programs as provided to other persons, including in the area of sexual and reproductive health, end quote. Critics of the treaty says this phrase, quote, creates and expands rights to abortion. This is not correct. This phrase has nothing to do with abortion. What it is about equality and access. Historically, people with disabilities have been disproportionately discriminated against when it comes to health care, especially women with disabilities around the world. Because they are blind, or have cerebral palsy, or autism, or any number of physical or mental impairments. They were often viewed as not being able to be mothers or wives or partners in a family. In fact, because of this prejudiced attitude, which still exists in so many places of the world, and probably some places here in America too, women with disabilities were, and in many cases still are, denied such vital services as pap smears, gynecological exams, breast cancer screenings, cervical cancer screenings, simply because they are disabled. Denying women with disabilities the same health prevention, screening, and intervention services that are provided to women without disabilities is blatant discrimination, prejudicial, unethical. The entire purpose of Article 25 of the UN Convention is to address this prejudiced view of the world that has led to thousands of unnecessary deaths of women because they have not been afforded the same access to reproductive health care as women without disabilities. That's why that was put in there. There's nothing to do with abortion. It simply says, Article 25 simply reflects the underlying principles of the treaty: equality and access for all. These same principles are the bedrock of our own Americans with Disabilities Act. So it has nothing to do with abortion, but some people have whipped it up and said it does. I want to point out, and in some countries, women with disabilities have been the most preyed upon. P-R-E-Y-E-D, most preyed upon. It's women with disabilities, physical, intellectual disabilities, who are the subject of maltreatment, mistreatment, sexual abuse. All we're saying is they've got to be treated the same as any other woman without a disability under the laws of that country. So if a country banned all abortions, that's their right to do so. They cannot then say, except you can have abortion if your unborn child is disabled. Can't do that. They can't make exceptions. Or if they provide any kind of services, they can't say to one woman that because you're not disabled, you get this service, but if you're disabled, you don't get it. No. Equality of access. I want to point out that 71 countries that have absolute prohibitions or significant restrictions on abortion have signed the treaty without reservations about reproductive health. Imagine that, 71. They felt that no harm would come for a reservation because they correctly determined that the treaty is no threat whatsoever to their sovereignty and their national laws limiting access to abortion. For Poland, a country with strict abortion limitations, they weren't going to sign this treaty. They were concerned about Article 25. But let me read you the exact language of the reservation put in by the nation of Poland. Quote, "The Republic of Poland understands that Article 23.1b and Article 25a shall not be interpreted in a way conferring an individual right to abortion or mandating state party to provide access thereto unless that right is guaranteed by the national law." End quote. Well, when they adopt that reservation, Poland signed on to the treaty. Poland's reservation states exactly what this treaty is about, a guarantee that women with disabilities will have access to the same health care services guaranteed to all other citizens by their national law. To say that the treaty is about creating and expanding abortion rights is just plain wrong. And to make such a claim is utterly unfounded and unfair. It's unfair to women with disabilities around the globe. It's creating a false claim out of thin air with no other purpose but to prevent ratification of this important treaty. Mr. President, most of the concerns raised by my colleagues are serious concerns. They are also concerns that can be addressed by thoughtful reservations, understandings, and declarations to the treaty. And indeed, they've already been addressed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They've acted. Now it's time for the full Senate to act. Let us bring the treaty to the floor of the Senate. Listen to senators' concerns, address those concerns, and then vote on the treaty. We owe this to millions of Americans with disabilities, our veterans, and others who want the same rights and access afforded by our own Americans with Disabilities Act. They want it to apply to the globe. We owe this to our veterans who want to be able to travel and pursue opportunities in other countries, knowing that they can enjoy the same rights and access that they have here in America. Senator Mark Kirk from Illinois said it very eloquently at a press conference we had with the veterans groups last week. He said, our veterans fought for freedom around the globe. They ought to be able to move freely around the globe. We owe this to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, countless companies who know not only this is the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do for business. There's all kinds of markets opening all around the world for people with disabilities, software, new kinds of equipment, new devices that are helping people with disabilities live more full and meaningful lives. A lot of that was developed here in America. We'd like to, I know our businesses would like to be involved with this treaty, to be able to be involved in raising the level of accessibility and opportunity for people with disabilities around the globe. Scores of religious groups want to see this treaty ratified. So, in closing, Mr. President, it's time to bring this to the floor. As I say, I know members have serious concerns about this, and they should be addressed. I believe the Foreign Relations Committee has addressed them. If not, then let's have a discussion about how we meet those reservations. We shouldn't just say that, well, I don't like the UN, so therefore we shouldn't adopt it. I think there's some people maybe don't like the UN. Okay, fine. I remember when we passed the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor. I was in Geneva with President Clinton when he signed it. Came back here, he submitted it to the Senate. I went to see Senator Helms, Senator Jesse Helms, to ask him to move this. There was probably no one in my 30 years of history in the Senate that disliked the United Nations more than Jesse Helms from North Carolina. So he went on to tell me just how bad the United Nations was and everything. But he would bring the treaty to the committee and have hearings and markup. And he called me as the first witness. I always appreciated that. And so Senator Helms, chairman of the committee, Republicans were in charge of the Senate at the time, brought the convention through the treaty, reported it out, and I remember him saying one time, well, he said he didn't like the United Nations, didn't care for the United Nations, but if this makes him do something good for a change, he'd be all right with it. And it passed the floor unanimously. Well, I ask those who maybe don't like the United Nations, fine, that's your right. Perhaps you have good and sufficient reasons not to like the United Nations. I have some problems with the United Nations myself at certain times, some of the things they do or don't do. But I see this in the same light as the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor. If this makes countries change and do things for the better, through persuasion, not through mandate. No country has to change their laws because of what the Committee on Experts say, but through moral weight, through persuasion, through working with other countries under this umbrella of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. If this causes countries to change their policies and make life better for people with disabilities around the globe, shouldn't we do it? Even though we may not like the United Nations? I just echo what Jesse Helms said. If this makes them do something good for a change, we ought to be for it. So I hope that my colleagues will listen to the veterans groups who are all for it. All the business groups that I am familiar with support it strongly. The religious groups, disability groups are united behind this. Listen to our former Republican leaders. Former President George Herbert Walker Bush, President Bush, former Senator Bob Dole, Majority Leader of the Senate, has worked his heart out on this. He cares about our sovereignty. He knows this is not going to take away our sovereignty. Every former leader of the Senate, Republican leader. Senator John McCain, telling me Senator John McCain doesn't care about our sovereignty. I happen to think he cares a lot about our sovereignty. He gave a lot of his life protecting our sovereignty. Mark Kirk, Senator Kelly Ayotte, Senator John Barrasso, Senator Kelly Ayotte, I mentioned Senator Murkowski, Senator Collins, all strong supporters of this. Mr. President, I've been involved in disability policy since I first got here in 1975 in the House. Everything I've ever worked on, Education of All Handicapped Children's Act, the Television Decoder Circuitry Act, or the Rehab Act, Rehabilitation Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA Act amendments later on in 2008. These were all nonpartisan. They didn't devolve into any kind of partisan issue. Now, that didn't mean that everybody voted for it, but they passed overwhelmingly, with both Republican and Democratic support. That ought to be the case with this, too. Yes, we should address the legitimate, honest concerns that people have about homeschooling and abortion and sovereignty. I believe we can do that with reservations. But I want every senator to know that nothing that this Committee on Experts will ever do under the CRPD takes precedence over our Constitution or over our laws. It does nothing to take away our sovereignty. And we can spell that out, just as we have in every other treaty that we have signed in the past. So, Mr. President, I hope that we can bring this to the floor and have a discussion. I hope we can work these out and have a strong support and vote to pass this treaty and help change the face of the globe as we've changed the face of America for people with disabilities. I yield the floor.